Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of videos on Irish history. Today we're looking at Ireland after World War II and in the period from 1950 to 1966. And how we'll be looking at that is in two ways. We'll be looking at how Ireland was governed in the 1950s through the first inter-party government from 1948 to 51 and its economic policy, and also how was Ireland governed in the Sean Lemass years through its economic policy, through its north-south relations and through its cultural policy. Let's take a deep dive, shall we? Now, the first inter-party government lasted from 1948 to 1951. It's something that you could be asked to write about if you are a junior cert student. You'd be looking at that 12-mark question. So when we're talking about an inter-party government, we're talking about a coalition. And a coalition, quite simply, is a government formed with more than one political party. Life didn't improve after the war ended in 1945. It was still very difficult. There were still food shortages, so rationing still continued. Unemployment and emigration were high, and Fianna Fáil were blamed for all of these policies. Sean MacBride set up a new party called Clown na Poblachta in 1946. Its Republican policies attracted some followers from Fianna Fáil, and when there was a general election in 1948, Fianna Fáil lost power, and the coalition government, which called itself this first inter-party government, replaced them. Its leader was Johnny Costello Fine Gael, who was Taoiseach, but the parties in the coalition also included Fine Gael, Labour and Clown na Poblachta. There were achievements of this government still, though, at the same time, as they made Ireland a republic in 1949, and Ireland was now therefore totally independent of Britain and no longer a member of the Commonwealth. It secured better prices for agricultural exports in the Anglo-Irish trade agreement, and it brought electric power to many more rural areas, which helped modernise Irish agriculture. What they also did was set up the IDA, the Industrial Development Authority, which is still in practice today, to support and develop export-led businesses in Ireland. It later changed its role to focus on attracting foreign companies to Ireland. Who I always find the most interesting of all the characters in the first inter-party government is Dr. Noel Browne. Now, Noel Browne was clearly ahead of his time, underappreciated, and it's only, again, like so many other things in history, with the benefit of hindsight, that we realise how visionary and how good he actually was. So, Noel Browne was a member of Clown na Poblachta, and as the Minister for the Health, his priority was to eliminate tuberculosis, TB, which killed 3,000 Irish people a year. He built special hospitals, he organised mass x-rays, and he brought in the new BCG vaccine to get rid of the disease. The number of deaths fell to 300 a year, and now it's virtually non-existent. Browne also wanted to introduce free medical care for all mothers and their children up to 16 years of age. This was called the Mother and Child Scheme. Fairly straightforward. Great idea, isn't it? Not so much in the 1950s. Opposition came from doctors who felt it would end the privacy of the doctor-patient relationship. More importantly, the Catholic Church objected to the scheme. Their reason was they felt that the state was interfering in private family members. Other members of the government supported the Catholic Church, so Browne was forced to resign. The government lost its majority in the Dáil and it called a general election, and this meant Fianna Fáil would return to power. Now, Fianna Fáil became back into power in the 1950s, and the 1950s is also known in Irish history as the lost decade, because of the lost generation that was forced to emigrate because of the failures of Fianna Fáil's economic policy. Now, the economy had struggled. Fianna Fáil's policy from 51 to 54 was simply to impose tariffs on imports, which failed to deal with the economic problems. Irish industry was inefficient and was confined to the small home market. So as a result of mass immigration this time, Irish communities flourished in the USA, even more so for the first time since the famine. Factories closed down and unemployment increased. As a result, 50,000 people a year emigrated during the 1950s looking for work. Now, in 1954, the second inter-party government came to power. However, it was no more successful than the previous governments in dealing with Ireland's economic problems. In 1957, Fianna Fáil returned to power, but there was an atmosphere of despair in the country. How did Ireland change this and start turning around? One of the main reasons was through Sean Lemass, who could be argued as Ireland's greatest ever Taoiseach. What was also important to note at this time was that in 1955, Ireland was admitted to the United Nations. Entry had been blocked by the Soviet Union because of Ireland's neutrality during World War II, but this was no longer an issue. So, in 1959, De Valera retired as Taoiseach and Sean Lemass took over. Lemass realised that the economic policy had not worked and that a new approach was needed. He appointed younger ministers, therefore, such as Donogh O'Malley and Jack Lynch. They were open to these new ideas. They were seen as younger and more dynamic. But the most important man of all was probably a civil servant called T.K. Whitaker, who drew up a plan to deal with the economic crisis, which was called the First Programme for Economic Expansion. Its main points quite simply were: 1. To attract foreign industry into Ireland by offering them grants to set up here, not taxing their profits, and providing the facilities these industries needed by building industrial estates, something that we would take for granted today, and that's quite commonplace. And number 2, they wanted to give grants to Irish farms to make them more efficient and thus enable them to export their goods. This strategy was very successful. So in the 1960s, many farms from America, Britain and Japan came to Ireland. The IDA was given the job of attracting these industries to Ireland. For the first time since the famine, the population increased in the 1960s. Unemployment went up and emigration, thankfully, started now to go down. In 1965, the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement was signed. It removed all the tariffs on Irish industrial exports to Britain, which was still Ireland's biggest trading partner. So between 1960 and 1968, over 600 firms had set itself up in Ireland. And of course, this would continue all the way through the Celtic Tiger, and would explain why Ireland has its high reputation even today. Now, another thing that's quite difficult to grasp in 2020 is how free education was seen as something that was so groundbreaking. It's something that's taken for granted. Lemass himself saw that Ireland needed an educated workforce. Only 30% of children went to secondary school in 1960. Donogh O'Malley, the Minister for Education, announced that school fees for secondary schools would be abolished in 1967. This would mean free secondary education for all children, and as a result, there was a huge increase in the numbers of children attending second level. This was also helped by free school transport for all second level pupils. These policies helped create a well-educated workforce to fill the new jobs provided by foreign companies. Another key feature of Lemass's reign was the efforts he made to improve relations between the North and the South, and indeed he was also helped by his Northern Irish counterpart, Terence O'Neill. Lemass believed that the best chance for Ireland's reunification lay in the South becoming so wealthy that the Unionists in the North would want to, and indeed have no other reason but to join. He improved relations between the two states and stopped attacking partition. He accepted the invitation of the new Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, Terence O'Neill, to visit Belfast. They encouraged cooperation in areas such as tourism and agriculture. O'Neill visited Dublin at a later date, but unfortunately extreme unionists such as Ian Paisley were horrified by this development, and this would lead to O'Neill's downfall. The start of the Troubles in 1968 would also bring an end to this idea of shared cooperation. There were also massive changes in culture at this time, and for the 1960s, the flower power, the hippie revolution, the idea of this new youth movement, while it didn't hit Ireland the same way it would have hit Europe and America, Ireland had its own changes too culturally. And part of that reason was seen through RTE and, surprise, surprise, the Catholic Church. So RTE was launched as a national television service in 1961. This led to a change in the attitude of society as Ireland was exposed to British and American cultures. Political and church leaders had their views challenged for the first time ever. Something that was seen as a no-no beforehand. The Late Late Show, while it may seem cheesy and cliched today, it was must-watch TV back in 1961. There were debates on social issues such as contraception and divorce, things that wouldn't be talked about and were refused to be talked about on Irish TV. Advertisements brought about changes in lifestyle and fashion also. It has been argued that television was a major factor in the decline of traditional Irish culture, so much so that by 1970 over 50% of Irish homes had a television. And now to the Catholic Church. At the beginning of the 1960s, the Catholic Church dominated Irish society. It would still dominate Irish society up until well into the 1990s. However, changes were happening within the Church. In 1959, the new Pope, John XXIII, called the Vatican Council of Bishops to modernise the Catholic Church. It brought in many changes, such as the Mass being said in the country's native language. Debate within the Church was encouraged, and it also encouraged ordinary Catholics to question the Church's teachings for the first time. This greatly lessened the influence of the Church on Irish society. In 1966, Sean Lemass retired. He had helped bring about major change in the Irish economy and in Irish society, and from someone that had served Ireland for the whole way from 1916 onwards, this may have been seen as his greatest achievement. Thank you for listening. I'll be back again with another video real soon. Goodbye.